Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Well, David and Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Delighted to be here, Carey.
Yeah. So I know a lot of my listeners are familiar with David, President of Barna Group. And David, you and I now do a new show together called Church Pulse Weekly. Plus, we've had some projects in the past, and you've been a multiple-time guest, a frequent flyer, as we like to say on this show. But I imagine, Scott, that like me, you're a leader I've gotten to know over the last little while. So I'd love to start with you. And you have one of the most fascinating leadership journeys I think I've encountered in my limited time in leadership. But you've got a career path that took you through Blockbuster, Einstein Bros, Bagels, Boston Markets, Ancestry.com, Tango Group, and Gloo, and I'm omitting some companies along the way. So can you tell us a little bit, and particularly interested in, you were franchise owner number one, I think, at Blockbuster, which is fascinating. So just give us the thumbnail version of your leadership trajectory.
Yeah, it's been an exciting 4 decades. Teresa and I met when we were 14 years old, and we've been on this journey together for a long time, and just had a great fortune of being born into an entrepreneurial family. My dad was an entrepreneur and was in the garbage business, so I grew up on the garbage truck with him, learning what did it mean to be able to sweep the corners, and the center of the room will take care of itself, and no job is done until the tools are cleaned and put away. So, get a lot of those early entrepreneurial experiences, and had the good fortune of walking into the very first Blockbuster video store on day 4. I was member number 91.
No way.
Yeah. So
what did you rent?
I don't remember, but I do remember that I thought, this looks like IBM and McDonald's got together and built a video store. And I thought there should be a lot of these.
Really? Now, okay, I got to break that down. What tripped in your mind to make you think that? Because you got to think pre-Blockbuster as we know it. This is just like local video store, right? That rents, VHS tapes at that time?
Yeah. So, it was, at that time, there were a lot of mom and pop video stores.
Yeah.
And, the guy that created it was a guy named David Cook, and he was just a systems thinker, and he was really brilliant. He had never been in the video business before, and he decided that he wanted to use his technology of barcoding to be able to advance a business. And he selected the video business, and he built a beautiful store, solved a lot of the problems of the mom and pops, and it was really well done to begin with. And, I just noticed it as a good opportunity. I was in the investment business, so, I was just excited to be able to potentially get involved in something early on that could really grow and scale. So I became the first franchisee.
All right, so you bought his store, or you just started a second one down the road or a different city?
He kept those stores. They were company-owned stores, and then we got the franchise rights for Chicago and Atlanta and Detroit and Milwaukee and Minneapolis. And we bought those franchise rights, and then we just started opening some franchise stores.
Okay, so you did that, and then how long were you you sold to, you eventually sold it in the 90s, right?
Yeah, so I was involved with that and was the first franchisee, and then got introduced. I introduced it to my dad's partner from the garbage business, Wayne Huizenga, who was a co-founder of Waste Management with my dad. So I knew Wayne, as an uncle. He was like Uncle Wayne to me. And so I introduced him to Blockbuster about 18 months in, and he liked it, and he bought Cookout, and he became my new franchisor. And then he bought our stores back, and I became the president and chief operating officer working for Wayne. And so that was when we grew it from, at that point, store 1 to store 5,000, and then sold it in 1993 to Viacom.
Wow, that's incredible. So Wayne Huizenga, listen, I'm not a sports guy, so don't ridicule me, but he owns some professional sports franchises, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, Wayne, he's passed since, but when in his prime, he was the owner of the Dolphins and of the Panthers and of the Marlins, all in South Florida. So Wayne was just an amazing entrepreneur. And a great boss. I learned so many things from him. And we just had a great run at Blockbuster.
This is the hard part of having two of you on this show, because David could easily occupy 90 minutes of fresh content, and Scott will have to do a solo show. But I got to ask you, what was one of the top lessons you learned from Wayne?
Wayne was a consummate deal guy. Okay. At Waste Management, they bought 1,000 different companies. Literally in the first year, they bought 168 companies the first year they went public. And so Wayne, he understood deals. And I always liked his approach to deals. And that was use logical structures, create alternatives, try to talk yourself out of your first choice, and never bluff. And that was a great lesson that I learned from Wayne, and I've used it ever since.
Well, we got ground to cover, but I got to come back to that in a solo episode down the road, because that in itself is probably 90 minutes. Okay, let's pick up the journey. Einstein Brothers Bagels, Boston Markets, Ancestry, Tango, Gloo. Take us on the tour.
Yeah, so we developed a competency to be able to create infrastructures to help other people be able to build great businesses, whether it was infrastructures that allowed video store people to build great Blockbuster video stores on our infrastructures. We did the same thing with Boston Market. We bought Boston Market, created great infrastructures, had franchisees start businesses on top of our platform. And it was at Boston Market that we also then created the Einstein's concept. Same thing, infrastructures to be able to help people scale, a bagel store. So whether it's a bagel store, a chicken store, a video store, or at the end of the day, it's a lot of the same capabilities that we brought forward here at Gloo to be able to help scale churches, to be able to help scale recovery centers, right? The patterns are in many respects very similar at the basic concept.
Wow. So can you give us just the elevator pitch / vision behind Gloo, which you founded about a decade ago, Scott? Is that right?
Yeah. Teresa and I, we founded Gloo about 2010. And it was, really we had been through our foundation serving into the church ecosystem and the parachurch and the faith and the recovery ecosystems for 20 years at that point in time through our private foundation, our family foundation. And we just decided in 2010 to not just be donors, but to actually put our full-time energy into being able to serve into those very important, we call them personal growth ecosystems. And so that's what we did. We jumped in there, and Gloo provides infrastructures and technologies to be able to allow churches or recovery centers or people that serve churches and recovery centers to be able to scale, to be able to get the economies of scale of technology, and to be able to, use platforms to operate one together with another.
And then Gloo has been working together with Barna. Actually, we had a pretty providential dinner on March 9th in Atlanta. We were all there for a webinar, and it was like David said, you free for dinner, and you got in my car, Scott, and we hadn't really spent a lot of time together. And then you, David, myself, and Brad Hill, who's now with Gloo, we went out for dinner in Alpharetta and said, hey, it would be fun to do some projects together at some time. And then a week later, we're on the phone launching some new stuff for this crisis together, right? Which is a lot of fun. And so how, David, are Barna and Gloo connected together in a really, I think, fun, cool way?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to the beginning, which was I'd been hearing about Scott and the team at Gloo for a number of years. We intersect on different levels, different projects, different churches, different partners that we work with. Oh, you got to meet Scott. A good friend of mine, Chris Kopka, had been saying for years, you got to meet Scott Beck. And so that was, sort of my introduction, was sort of introductions through mutual friends. And for a long time, we sort of held off meeting. I think Scott would say the same thing. It's like we both knew about the other's work, but we sort of felt like, we're both really busy, and like everyone is, especially now in COVID world. But we were holding that off, and then as chance would have it, or I would say as the Lord would have it, last summer we vacationed in Boulder. My family and I. My sister lives there, and her family, and we love hiking 14ers and. We spent 3 weeks in Colorado, and during the middle of that time, I went through some strategic planning with our team, and they all came out to Boulder, Colorado, and they're like, I think this guy Scott Beck lives in Colorado. I think that's where Gloo's headquartered. We should schedule a time, and so we ended up meeting at the end of some really interesting strategic planning meetings at the end of the week, that very week, and it was mid-July of 2019, and it was really interesting, sort of setting the stage for how I think about our partnership with Gloo today, because I went through this period of some life planning, of sort of resetting what I felt like God was calling me to do, and what I felt like God was calling our company to do, and the team, our leaders. And it was sort of like a Tuesday, my life plan. A Wednesday, Thursday was our new strategic plan, and then Friday, we just have some meeting with this guy named Scott. And so it was an interesting sort of pivotal week because that was a really dynamic meeting in ways that, was sort of more than a client relationship or more than just a potential research study. It was like, hey, this is really fun talking to this guy and dreaming together. And so over the next 30, 60 days, we just started meeting, talking, getting our teams talking, figuring out what we might do together. And I said, hey, what about State of the Church 2020? We've got a pretty big year coming up. It's the end of one decade, the beginning of a new decade. Maybe we could serve the church together, looking at what was happening in terms of this. It was again way before anyone had heard of coronavirus, during this period of epic disruption and transformation of the church. And so that's where it started, was a vision to try to help come alongside the church during this year. The start of a pivotal decade, the church coming into a new digital moment. And so State of the Church 2020 was sort of born mid-July, right after I had hiked a 14er.
So we're going to get into some crisis leadership, decision-making. How do you lead through this? But I always love pulling back the curtain and just being transparent. So for those leaders who regularly listen to this podcast, maybe you've taken the crisis leadership course that my team's offering for free, or you listen to the podcast David and I just launched called Church Pulse Weekly, where you've got real-time polling data. As I joke, it's all the power of a pollster in the hands of a pastor. And you can pull your congregation, pull your team, pull your community, civic leaders, the whole deal. And, in many ways, it seems similar to what you've been doing now for your whole adult life, David, and George Barna before you at Barna Group. I mean, when I was a pastor of a tiny church, I was reading Barna's books and looking at his polls, and it was fascinating. So this is what you've been doing, but all of a sudden the real-time results are being powered through the database that you've been building for the last decade at Gloo, Scott. So this is an opportunity for you to kind of pour steroids through the ability to collate a lot of data quickly, to be able to synthesize a whole lot of information quickly into meaningful patterns that we get to interpret about what's happening in real time to leaders and churches and so on. So feel free to nuance that in any way you want, but I would love for people to have an understanding of the difference that this real-time data can make in leadership, which is really possible for the first time, I think, in history, the history of the church anyway.
I'll let Scott describe some of his thoughts about database and platform and stuff, because that's, I think, very compelling. But for me, as you say, I've been 25 years here at Barna, and part of my life plan and our company's strategic plan was sort of this idea of, okay, what can I do next? If all of that's sort of prelude to what God may want to use me personally and our company now in the future, so much change is happening, and I'm such a deep believer in data-informed leadership and not just going only on our gut. I think we as leaders get really good at trusting our gut, knowing how to make good decisions on the fly, making decisions every day, every hour. And that's important. But being data informed as the world is rapidly changing couldn't be more important. And that was before COVID, and recognizing, especially now, COVID is going to have many, many implications for leaders of all types, but especially for Christian leaders, being a data-informed leader of what's really happening in people's lives, what's really happening in the marketplace, what's really happening with millennials and Gen Z, among whom we're seeing even greater levels of anxiety and pressure because all of a sudden their bridge to the future, employment, finances, moving, they're back in their, I've got two college girls, they're back in their parents' home. They're like, crap, what are we going to do now? And so, recognizing that being a data-informed leader, it was always very important, but you absolutely can't get up every morning now as a leader without being a data-informed leader. And that's what's exciting for me as a social researcher who usually, it's like takes weeks, sometimes months to get back the data. Having more real-time tools to put those in the hands of pastors and Christian leaders, it really changes the game for us.
Yeah, for sure. Well, when we first started partnering with David and Barna and the team there, the whole idea of a platform is, we're a set of capabilities. Let's think of them as data capabilities that allow, privacy and security and handle all the compliance and handle all of that type of technology underneath the scenes, so that now all of a sudden, Barna could have data interactions with churches on a direct basis at scale. And that was really the innovative thought, was like, hey, state of the church, run the normal research, but then be able to use these capabilities to run the state of your church. So then now, for the first time at scale, Barna was going to be able to serve into a church with the Barna Church Pulse to be able to help the church understand the state of their church and relate that to the overall research. So that was the big innovation that the two of us cooked up here that really God had for us in the fall of 2019. And then, fast forward, to literally March 10th, when we did the network webcast with over 1,000 different networks tuning into the webcast that the two of you co-hosted. And then the next day, the world changes, and we say, wow, we can take these capabilities and now make them available to churches so that they can be understanding the state of the church this week, not necessarily over the next decade, but literally this week. And so being able to allow Barna now to have a whole series of additional surveys and polls and tools that they can put into the hands of all those churches, that's been the big move that we've made now in response to COVID. And that's the power of having a well-architected platform, is you can make those kinds of moves. And you're right, then churches can now start to get real-time data. What are other pastors doing? And what about my congregants? How are my congregants doing? And so we're using the different check-ins, the leader check-in, the congregant check-in, and the pastor poll, to be able to allow that all to come alive right now in the moment to serve the church.
We're going to get into some of the functionality of that, but the question that's on my mind, Scott, and I would love for you to answer to the extent that you feel comfortable, is a decade ago, you pretty much could have done anything you wanted with your life. I mean, you could have, you had enough resources that you could have gotten on a boat and just floated through the oceans for the rest of your life. You could have been lying on a beach. You could have been in some mountain home. You could have, frankly, if you wanted to do something else, you could have jumped into another business or another line of work. What made you say, no, I'm going to hire a couple hundred engineers, build a team, invest in this, and create the infrastructure using data to help churches scale? I'm just curious, what was your thinking?
Well, it's really just a matter of, getting it. I've had some great mentors, and one of my mentors was a guy named Oscar Remick, and Oscar was a leader in the higher education field, and he was the president of Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, and he was the dean of the School of the Arts for the New York University system, and ended up at Bangor Theological Seminary. But Oscar was a great mentor of mine, and his whole strategy was like, be used up for good and die. He's like, that was his whole thing, is that he wanted to be used up for good, and then he wanted to pass on into the next world, right? And move into eternity and get used up for good. And so, we've always just been operating with that same mental model, Teresa and I. So, a decade ago, the idea of like just golfing or cruising, we like to be entertained, and we like to do the stuff that we like to do for leisure, but there isn't anything that we like more than like solving problems to help champions scale. These champions are out there on the front line, okay, hope against all hope, doing whatever they need to do to serve into their local communities, whether it's a pastor or whether it's a church planter, whether it's a recovery care manager, or, a person in a small house with, 12 young women going through eating disorder recovery. I mean, these people are just like giving their lives against all odds to be able to serve into these people. And so for us to basically say, hey, we've been given some capabilities, we know how to do some things, we've got some relationships, we've got some capital to put it at work and to be used up for good, that was the whole idea. And so, that's just where Teresa and I shook out in 2010, and we've been on the journey for the last decade. God willing, we've got a couple more decades ahead of us, and we're just loving it.
I know what you mean about the good feeling you get rolling out of bed and saying, I get to help leaders today. That's a good feeling. That's a great feeling. I'd love to drill down a little bit more on how data can help church leaders expand their ministry, because that's sort of the vision that unites what I'm, not the data part, because I only have the capabilities you two bring to the table. I have a voice. I can help. I'm interested in helping church leaders and leaders do better. But David, it's Barna that really helps churches now for 35 years use data to make informed decisions. And Scott, you just built this huge platform that moves that to real time. So for leaders who are like, yeah, once in a while I see a poll and I realize there's more atheists, more agnostics. Here's what's happening with Gen Z. The economy's, negative 9% contraction or whatever. But like, how is that really going to help churches scale? How is that going to help us grow and make our impact bigger for the kingdom?
Well, I've got lots of different answers for that. Of course, you could expect that from the president of Barna, but a few different ways that I think of is number one, most importantly, is to change our paradigm of what's really happening. I've seen right from the very beginning of working with George Barna, how his projects and his research and his thinking, which, he mentored me for 14 years before I started leading the company, but how he was changing people's perspectives. And even today, some of his groundbreaking work still frames a lot of the ways that church leaders in North America and indeed around the world talk about and think about the paradigm of ministry. And some of that's for good, some of that's not for good. I mean, like not that Barna Group has always had exactly the right frame of reference, but by amplifying other people's voices, we can better understand what is happening and how to respond to that as leaders, which brings me to that second point of how important it is. I think leaders, and I feel it as a 46-year-old leader today, more than ever, that it's really easy as a leader to settle into your rhythms and into your perspectives and how you think and know the world works and how you can influence it. And one of my great passion points about being a data-informed leader is that you actually hear other people's voices through research that you just simply can't hear otherwise. And so when I started working on the book with Gabe Lyons on Christian, that was my first real experience of personally living into this Barna calling, of telling the story of young non-Christians, 16 to 29-year-olds, their perceptions of the church, that Christianity was judgmental and hypocritical and anti-homosexual. And so we were amplifying the voices of thousands of young people who gave us their time during an online survey, and helped Christians understand the perspective of non-Christians. And that was this paradigm shifting moment for me. I mean, I remember literally working on these chapters, sort of quaking in my keyboard, like, man, I'm writing about the church being hypocritical and judgmental. Like, I don't even really feel this way, but this is what I just saw in all this data. And so I have to be honest. I have to be clear about what we found. I can't sugarcoat the findings. And so that was an example, I think. And so many people responded to that book as an example of, wow, we didn't know that this is what people really felt. We didn't understand, like, the idea of being anti-homosexual. That was such a revelation for so many leaders, that the church had by and large begun to be defined by what it was against rather than what it was for. And so that's, I think there's so many different elements but we could start there, that good data informed leadership affects your paradigm of your work. It affects your ability to hear from people you would ordinarily not understand or hear from, and then to be able to engage effectively. You can actually see clearly, lead your church confidently, engage effectively in the world. Some of the themes we've set out for our State of the Church work, and without that, you can't actually be as effective as God intends. And that leads to the final point, which is, we all got into this business of Christian leadership, or of leadership in general, because we wanted to change lives. And I'm convinced that at the end of the day, without paying attention to some kind of real data about what kind of impact we're making, we end up really wasting or frittering away or diminishing our impact. We can look at it from a spiritual perspective. We have an adversary, my belief that we have an adversary who wants to derail us from true and transformational impact. Get a huge church and look at what great impact you're having. Well, maybe we're not actually transforming lives as much as we thought. Maybe we don't actually know the hearts of people as well as we imagine. Maybe we haven't really moved them in other areas of their lives, their relationship well-being, their emotional well-being, as much as we thought. And so for me, that's another part of this. We have to be better informed in order to make the kind of differences that we all signed up for at the beginning of our journeys.
I think about the staff meetings and the board meetings that I've been through and so many leaders have been through. And sometimes, honestly, they're just exercises in creative guessing. It's like, well, I think this is the issue, so why don't we try that, right? Scott, what would you add to data-informed decision-making? Take us a little bit more behind the scenes at Gloo and some of the capabilities that are there, because as much as I've talked about it and spent quite a bit of time immersing myself in it, I think we're just kind of scratching the surface of what's possible.
Yeah, I would, what David was just talking about is, like, how do we use research and how do we use information sort of at the macro level, right? It's like, hey, we see these trends and people are thinking this way and you need to be aware of it so that then you can make the right adjustments to be able to serve people within a greater context of reality and in terms of the knowledge that Barna can help them with. I want to take it all the way down to the micro level, right? At a micro level, what's a pastor doing? He's greeting people at the door. Hey, you're new. Where are you from? How is this your first time here? Where do you work? Tell me about your family, right? And then what's he doing? Immediately, he or she after that moment is saying, great. Hey, I want to introduce you to Bob over here, right? Because Bob lives in your neighborhood as well. Or Sue over here. Yeah, she's in that industry. Or, hey, we want to get you involved into this class. Well, what just happened is what we call know, match, and catalyze. At the micro level, all leaders, all pastors, all therapists, they're in the know, match, and catalyze business. They try to know somebody. They try to match them to the right next thing that's going to catalyze them in growth, right? And then they want to know whether that worked or not. And so at the micro level, that same kind of capabilities are available. And you can use little assessments to help you know people at scale. And then you can use some simple math to be able to help match them to the right step based on that. And what's the piece of content that we can catalyze them to, or how do we move them into that small group? So quite frankly, the technologies are super accessible in terms of just extending the reality of how people already operate. Pastors, therapists, counselors, they're all in that same business of know something, match somebody to something that's going to catalyze them. And our technologies are just enabling that at scale. I mean, ultimately, it's important to realize that, we believe that relationship catalyzes growth. Relationship is the key catalyst in any kind of personal growth journey. And so the technology needs to not disintermediate the relationship. It needs to re-intermediate the relationship. How do we bring the superpowers of technology into those relational interactions? And if we do that, we're going to be successful, and we're going to scale that relational interaction and allow a lot of that great energy to get released. So that's what we do at Gloo. We focus on the micro as well as enable that macro. Was that helpful, Carey?
Yeah, that's super clear. And I was just looking up, it's episode 155. Matt Engel, who works with you at Gloo, was somebody that I met 2 or 3 years ago, and we had a fascinating lunchtime conversation. So if you want to go back, we'll link to it in the show notes. But Matt talked a lot about how big data could inform, or even collection of data, or even matchmaking. David, I don't know whether it was you or Sean Morgan. I've been on infinite Zoom calls like the rest of the world for 30 days now, so it all becomes one, right? But it was Sean Morgan or you that said his daughter is going to college this fall. I think it was maybe Sean. And, when we showed up at college, I mean, you just kind of randomly get dumped there with 1,000 other kids, and you don't know anybody and they don't know you. But they're using technology right now to okay, well, what do you like to stay up at night or get up early in the morning? What are your study habits? What are your hobbies? Where are you from? What are your interests? What kind of music do you like? Are you a neat freak? Are you a slob? They wouldn't ask it that way. But basically what they're doing is profile matching all the incoming students so that you don't end up with the opposite roommate, so that you can actually connect socially and build friendships online ahead of time before you even get there. And I think it was Sean who was speculating that perhaps in the future, the churches would have that kind of technology, so it has this digital connection, all these views that have popped up online, all these people who have liked your page. If they're going to plan a visit, you can almost pre-select them into affinity groups or that kind of things with people that they would connect with. Do you think that is a role that data could play, and data decisions, perhaps, Scott, in the future in the church?
Absolutely. I mean, that's knowing and matching.
Right.
And that's exactly the idea is, how do we, I'm not a Bible expert. One of my other mentors, Dennis Rainey, the founder of Family Life Ministries out of Little Rock, great mentor of mine. He's always thinking that same thing in terms of hey, how can we apply these technologies to be able to help us do some of this knowing and matching on a better base than that. But absolutely, churches can be using that for those types of purposes. Get people into the right small group, to get people connected, be able to understand whether if that small group actually made a transformation. As we're working with David on State of the Church, we've got these 5 areas of flourishing, right? The relational flourishing, spiritual flourishing, in your health, are you flourishing? Financially, are you flourishing? And these different areas of flourishing, it's hey, when you started into that small group, where were you at? When you ended that small group, where were you at? Was there a difference made? So there's a lot of very practical, simple implementations to be able to bring technology in service of all of that.
David, can you, because I know this is going to develop over time, that's what happens, but can you take us under the hood a little bit of Church Pulse Weekly, just so people can see what is now actually available for pastors and church leaders in real time? Because a lot of it's set, but it's also customizable. You can ask specific questions, right? So can you show us both in terms of the numbers. Obviously, you're going to track attendance, you're going to track how many people, but you can start to measure qualitatively how your people are doing. So kind of what Scott said, it's not the state of the church, it's also the state of your church.
Yeah, happy to. Well, first, obviously, some of your listeners will be aware of the fact that we've started this podcast, and I'll start there, which is, on March 10th, we hosted a webcast for network leaders, and March 11th we came home, and the NBA shut down its season, and the world changed quickly, and we decided that we wanted to be able to help leaders navigate this reality. And so you being a great leader of leaders and influencer of leaders and podcast host, and us doing research, it was this idea of coming together on a weekly basis just to help talk about what we were seeing, and then building that not just on the two of us and our thoughts, but building that on the voice of pastors and leaders and the pressures they were facing. And all of that is data that we're now collecting through Gloo, alongside Gloo. And that's where it starts. There's a leader check-in where leaders can actually add their voice at churchpulseweekly.com to see what's happening in our church, what's next, what are the pressures you're facing. Every week we've got new questions, and we've got some tracking questions, and you can go online and sort of check that out. And that's again, speaking of what I was talking about earlier about how it is that research helps to inform leaders. It's that you get a bigger perspective about what other leaders are facing, and then you can make your own decisions on the basis of that. So that's the first, sort of piece that you can add. Obviously, you can listen to the podcast if you're interested in hearing us talk about that. But then the second, really, I think, critical stuff, and Scott was alluding to this earlier, under this idea of seeing and hearing what's happening among your people. Was that we really fundamentally believe that one of the disruptions that was happening well before COVID, but is certainly amplified in the coronavirus world, is that we're actually more separated from the people we serve than we realize. We don't actually see what's going on in their lives as leaders as much as we might think. And I think any pastor, any leader actually would admit that to be the case, that the people we lead, we don't always have a holistic view into what's happening. And so we've been working for a long time here at Barna. Gloo's been working on this for a long time, of understanding human flourishing. We've looked at a lot of different studies and researchers out there and try to bring the best thinking forward about what does it mean for people to really flourish in all of their lives, spiritually, relationally, financially, vocationally, mental and emotional health. And so the other big thing you can do at Church Pulse Weekly is check in with people. So we've been working on this for a bunch of months with Gloo, and really much longer, our team at Barna and Gloo's team. You heard Scott talk a little bit about some of these commitments that they've learned about, like relationships catalyze growth. Well, you can't have a good relationship with somebody if you don't really know them. And so part of what we then did was we took all this work and thinking and quickly pivoted in the coronavirus world to create a shorter, smaller, simpler question set around these 5 areas of flourishing. And then, as you mentioned, you can have some customized questions if, as a church leader, you want to add some things into this to say, hey, I want to ask a specific set of things of my people. And we've already had, tens of thousands of congregants take that survey now on behalf of their leader to give them feedback. And I think this is a great way for us. I mean, I've seen now more than ever on my social media, just scrolling through a lot of pastors that I follow. They're like, what am I going to talk about now after Easter? We're still doing digital church. Even if after digital church is sort of done, we're back in our buildings. Like, how do we really talk to people where they're really at? Well, mental and emotional health, that's a huge question. Well, now you actually have a simple free tool with this Barna Church Pulse to check in on the mental and emotional health of people. It's a simple couple questions. How are they doing in terms of anxiety? How are they doing in terms of their relationship? How are they doing in terms of their job? It's all simple and anonymous. People don't have to identify themselves, but you could get a clear picture of the pressure points that your church is facing, and a custom layer of that as well, of really asking some of the simple questions that are most important to you. And that might inform the topics that you preach about and how you think about sort of the disruptions in COVID and what you might start to think about going into the summer, and what you might sort of think about how knowing your people better helps you match them up to the right content or the right responses. And then, as Scott said, catalyze them towards, the growth opportunities that they need to have related to this epic change, this epic disruption that coronavirus has brought. So that's a little bit about how Church Pulse Weekly has been built. And again, part of our commitment at Barna has been to try to help bring even better metrics of success and transformation to leaders, that it's not just enough to show up each week for, the number of people who show up, that there's a deeper story of the kind of impact God is asking of us as Christian leaders today.
Yeah, a lot of people have suspicion around data, particularly big data, privacy concerns, et cetera. Scott, do you want to speak to that? Like, how does that work? Is there anything church leaders should be afraid of or concerned about when it comes to collecting that kind of micro data on their congregation?
Yeah, very important to really have a good philosophy around data in total. First of all, we operate under the presupposition that users need to be able to 100% control their data. And they need to own it. They need to be able to have control over it. They need to be able to explicitly have consent as to who can see what. Like David was saying, if in running that church survey, the church can set it up so that it can be fully anonymous, or it can be optionally anonymous, where the individual can also opt into being able to be known. But that has got to be the choice of the congregant. We've got to put the power in the hands of them. So, at Gloo, what we do is we make sure that all of the infrastructures are HIPAA compliant, just like with a medical system. They're compliant with the tough European privacy standards. And California's got the toughest standard of all in the United States. It's called the CCPA. And so that we've got HIPAA and CCPA compliant infrastructures. And that's good, because then churches can know that those infrastructures, they're in effect adopting those types of privacy capabilities when they're leveraging these types of infrastructures. But ultimately, it's got to be consent. It's all based on consent. And you need to be really careful that you're using infrastructures that manage those consents and that do control the access and that do have the right security, security and privacy wrappings around them. And it's where we spend a lot of time, money, and energy at Gloo.
We got into this a little bit when I interviewed Matt Engel, if I remember correctly. But so many companies are already using data on consumers. All your loyalty rewards programs are kind of quietly tracking in the background without even your consent, or every time you fill out an evaluation or an opinion survey, you're giving that kind of thing. How does that give companies, thinking about the corporate world, how does that give them an advantage over companies that are not using that kind of information?
Well, I mean, knowing the people that you're trying to serve, or you're trying to grow, or you're trying to help is just critical. We said it. It's what pastors, it's what therapists, it's what people do, is they need to know. So being able to bring the superpowers that are available in the corporate world and being able to bring those to bear, instead of trying to sell you something, to use those same capabilities to be able to help you in a growth journey. I mean, that's just legit, right? Yeah. If we're not doing that, if we're not grabbing hold of, God brought technology into existence, and he brought technology into existence not by mistake. I mean, he knows that it's there, and it's there ultimately for his purposes. It's our job, okay, both at the big technology and the frontline pastor and the leader, it's our job to wrestle with, how do we bring technology into alignment with God's purposes to be able to accelerate the work that we're trying to do, that good work that's out there. Everybody, we believe there's a moral imperative, okay, a moral imperative to figure out how to use technology and how to use data for good. The bad guys are using it. Okay.
Yeah.
They got it, right? Well, we can't let them have a superpower and not bring that same superpower into bear on behalf of the good work that those people are trying to do out there. And that's the whole idea, is to bring it within a compliant, secure environment, but to be able to help them grab those superpowers to be able to accelerate and multiply the ability that they have to change lives right there on the front line.
Anything you'd add to that, David?
Yeah, I'd like to add something quickly to that is, a lot of the work I've done interviewing millennials and Gen Z, Christians, non-Christians alike, certainly the future church doesn't think about data and privacy in the same ways that older adults do. And again, I think there's some good reasons why there's been skepticism of big data or data privacy, and like why governments are sort of clamping down because there are misuses of that all over the place. And we actually need a Christian theology of information, a Christian theology of data and data collection and data privacy. There's actually a very human flourishing theological understanding, I think, of how all of this exists in this new, what I call digital Babylon, right? Digital Babylon is this new context. I've been writing about this, thinking about this for 7-8 years, that we're living in a new world where screens disciple, where the infrastructures form our lives, streaming services, social media, these big companies, they're all so invasive, if you want to say, or enveloping us. We're living in a digital world, and like we wouldn't want to go through coronavirus without the tools and opportunities that are being provided. Like the economy would certainly grind to a halt, and our lives would be just miserable, even more miserable without technology. So as Scott says, there's a real gift in technology today. I look back at 500 years ago, Martin Luther said that the printing press was God's agent of grace because it propelled a freedom of information, a freedom of talking about theological concepts with the general population. The control points were changing. And so when I think about digital Babylon and the opportunities that we have now as Christian leaders to, think about a different kind of philosophy, a different paradigm of ministry, we cannot continue to do ministry even without COVID. We could not continue to do ministry. I call it dial-up ministry in a Wi-Fi world.
Yeah.
We can't hope that people show up every few weeks for an hour here, an hour there. I think I was just talking to my friend Gabe Lyons yesterday, where he was saying that he, his daughter, his son, they're all starting these Zoom discipleship groups. I don't want to speak out of turn about their family, but like I'm hearing from him and others that they're using technology to try to influence their friends, to try to create a deeper, more interesting rhythm for Bible study. I just was so inspired by that story of, here are Gabe's kids, being active on technology to start using information, using technology to sort of propel a biblical view of how to live today. And so I just think there's such incredible opportunities for us as leaders to not resist these sort of technological tools, and then to do more effective ministry in this new digital context. And that's what fires me up about it.
Yeah, I'm glad we dove down deep on that a little bit for a couple of reasons. Number one, David, you were on this podcast a couple of years ago where you shared the findings that the average age of the senior pastor in America was at that point 54, which is probably closer to 56 or 57 today. And again, you're right. Older generations, boomers, older Xers, they're more suspicious of technology perhaps than Gen Z or younger millennials would be. Second thing is, here we are, Scott, you're in Colorado, David, you're in California, I'm north of Toronto, and we're having a real-time conversation because of what? Technology. That's why. We're using microphones. You're listening to this on your AirPods or in your earbuds. And, so on the one hand, we have all this questions about technology in the same way that my phone has lit up with comments, as we've talked about, on Church Pulse Weekly, David, 49% of churches are all growing now, that their digital attendance is greater. And I've received hundreds of comments, which are, well, how do we know those views are real, right? And it's like, why are we starting there? Why is that where we go every time there seems to be innovation, where we question it, we kick at it, we ask questions? But I got to ask the last question, which is normally people would expect to pay for this. So it's not the last question on the podcast, just on this train of thought. This is free to the user. So why and how is that possible, Scott? How did that happen? Why is this free to churches?
Well, we had a real strong belief that ultimately the platform and the capabilities had to have a very powerful free layer. If not, then they wouldn't be available to everybody. And so we wanted them available to everybody. And with Barna and Barna's willingness to take significant parts of their research and their capabilities and make that free, and us taking significant parts of the infrastructures and making that free, we create an environment where you can have a free layer of capabilities and research and content that sits on top of that can be free, and it can be free forever. It's not a free trial. No, it's free. It's free forever. Yeah, there's opportunities to buy premium things from Barna. And if you're buying something that's a premium thing from Barna and you're leveraging the technology, then we have a revenue share in that, and that allows us to get funded as well. So there's a significant free layer, free forever, and then there's premium opportunities on top of that. And it makes the whole thing work. But it also allows it to get everywhere, and it allows the smallest churches with very few resources to be able to have free and free forever. We're really grateful to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, and I think we all have similar models. 98% of what I do is free, but the 2% that's paid powers everything else. And I think that's a really good model, because then we always say it's an unofficial model. We want our motto. We want our free stuff to be better than most people's paid stuff. And, so it's not like, oh, here's the free thing. Hope it doesn't break in 30 seconds, or, oh, you hit the paywall, you're done. So I really appreciate that. So thank you. Got to talk to you because we are leading in a time of crisis. And the idea is that you sped up the data that's available to real time, weekly, like you can check in with your church in real time every week, et cetera. And now we understand a lot more about that. But I want to pull the camera back a little bit and talk about crisis leadership. So Scott, my guess is you've led through a couple of crises in your business career, nothing like this, but what are some things you've learned along the way from mentors or from your own leadership about how to lead well in crisis? And then David, I'll throw the same thing to you.
Yeah, like I said, Teresa and I and our 4 daughters, we've been operating in a lot of volatile environments for the last 40 years. So, I mean, literally, I can think back to the gas lines in the late 70s and the 18% prime interest rate, 70% marginal tax rates of 78, 79, and 80, and think about the Black Monday in 89 and what happened there, and all the different crises that we've gone through over the different years. And this is new. This is unique. There's never been one like this. But the key in crisis is to be able to, number one, keep your wits about yourself. Get to your base, get to establish, to be able to take a breath and to understand that with every crisis comes, peril, but there also comes great opportunity. And so, with that mental model, then you can be able to look at it, and you can look at it in a different way. And it's important for leaders to be able to do that. Yep, you're going to get shaken a little bit. You're going to have a lot more uncertainty. Yep, that's all real. How do you step back? How do you start thinking about how do we use this to our advantage? Ultimately, our job is to love God and be called according to his purposes. His job is to make all things work together for good. And that means crisis as well. And so, as a leader, love God, be called according to his purpose. Take a moment, look, get good counsel around you, but look for the opportunity. Look for the opportunity that exists in the crisis.
David, how about for you?
Well, I've gone through a lot of crises as well, but maybe not quite as many years as you, Scott. But I think back to this crisis in my first year of leading Barna, and feeling like I had sort of taken over the Barna Group, and we had some external and internal issues within the first 12 months that I was like, dang, man, I had to go deep inside myself to my convictions. And it was actually a crisis that about a year into it, I was like, no, this is my company. I'm going to save it. It was like I couldn't look to George Barna. I couldn't look to investors or to different people. And it was like I had to really figure my way through it. And I had to go to this deep sense of what was God calling me to do, and get clear on that. What were my principles in trying to lead my own thing in my own time. And that was hard to do, but getting really clear on the things I could control and I couldn't control. It turns out there's a lot more stuff I couldn't control, but the few things that I could control, I was like, I'm going to just nail those things. And that was actually the most important thing, like just controlling my own emotions, forgiving the people that had caused some of the damage within the company, not lashing out, I couldn't control them, right? So I had to do my very best at kind of forgiving and moving on and figuring out my way forward. And I'm feeling a lot of that this time, this last 4 weeks. Like I can't control very much. It turns out you don't really control that much anyway. Even non-crisis situations, you just feel like you have more control because nothing. There's no disequilibrium, that happens, right? So you're like, man, look at me. I'm a professional business person, but it doesn't turn out that you're really doing anything. It's just life is good enough in our world today where, you make money and you drive home and things keep moving forward. But in crisis, you're reminded you really don't control that much except for yourself, your posture, your commitments. I've been going through a big family crisis for a couple of years with my wife's health, who has brain cancer. So, I've been learning and relearning this sense of dependence on the Lord, and you can't really control that much. And all you can really control is your own heart and your own capabilities. And sort of this is on the personal side, but I think it relates to general crisis as well. Like I started working on these lists of the things gained and the things lost. And this is one of my last point on this is like, I actually think it's really important to acknowledge the things that you lose through a crisis. In my wife's brain cancer situation, it's been a big list of things we've lost. But it's important to make a list of the things you gain and what are the gains that you have. And Scott's sort of saying, it's like, yeah, think about those opportunities. Think about the ways that you can go do. Like my relationship with my own kids has gotten a lot deeper and more. We've sort of fast forward into an adult. They were teenagers when this all happened, but we fast forward into a more kind of like I find great friendship with my kids today. That is, and certainly in the gain column. And so, figuring out who the kind of person you're going to be through that crisis is for me as important as how you're going to, lead through to a better bottom line or a better outcome or whatever. But, I certainly want to be a better person at the end of a crisis than I started it. And so those are some of the things that I've been learning about, leading through crisis is figuring out, what you really can control and who you want to be through that whole crisis.
Thank you for sharing that too, David. I know you and I've talked a lot just offline as friends about Jill's cancer and everything. But, when you said what you can gain, I'm like, oh man, I don't think there's anything in that column. And, for you to actually go through that exercise and share a few of the things is super, super helpful and transparent. One of the things that amazed me about both of you, we literally had that dinner March 9th, the Monday night in Atlanta. It's like, I think I said to you, Scott, maybe I'll fly some of my team members down in the summer. This is long days before the world closed. We'll talk about what we could possibly do together and dream together. And then a week later, I'm on the phone with you guys going, all right, what about doing this in light of everything that's happened? And here we are, launching this Church Pulse Weekly project together, the podcast, the live show, more importantly, the database that it enables behind it. Both of you pivoted really, really quickly. Do you want to walk through the thought process on that? Because not everybody did in this crisis. And I was really amazed. I mean, I was sitting there that Monday upstairs in my living room, praying and thinking and on phone calls, knowing that I had one with you guys coming up later in the day going, what does this make possible? What does this make possible? How can we serve? How can we help? But I want to go through your mental process in the midst of the crisis and how and why you pivoted so quickly, what you changed, what you didn't change. I think it's an interesting case study, 30 days on the other side.
Well, I'll be happy to say that, after the big webcast and then coming home, I remember for me, the first sign this was going to be a real deal was when the NBA suspended its season on Wednesday night. And obviously some of the stock market started to take a hit and other things started to change that week. And there was some, we were all thinking about that even when we were together in Atlanta. I actually flew home from the webcast from Atlanta to LA, and there were people coughing on that flight, and there so much so that they even made an announcement like, "Please cover your mouths while you cough."
Oh boy,
it was bad.
You and I didn't even shake hands. We I think bumped elbows or something at that event, David.
So so Jill had a medical appointment on Friday, and as we drove back, Scott said, "Hey, can I get a few minutes of your time?" And he started to say, "Hey, I think there's some opportunities here." So he really helped. It's been a pleasure working with Scott because he thinks in terms of systems and structures and change, and I do too, but in a different way. I think more to like social change and what will this mean for the numbers and how will people's perspectives change. But he's like, how do we change all the things we've been working to take an opportunity? So we worked through the weekend, and then on Monday we started to talk. He had started talking to some of his team on Monday. I started to talk to my team through the weekend. I gave him a few heads up, but by Monday we had a new paradigm, a new thought about how it was that these tools could be still useful, in fact maybe even more useful because of the urgency of the moment. And I think this disruption changes things quickly, and there are a lot of places, and I think the story is yet to be written in all the ways we'll look back 2 years, 3 years, 10 years from now at what coronavirus changes, and not to mention just the tremendous loss of life and suffering and loss of jobs and the suicides and mental health challenges and domestic abuse and addictive behaviors. I mean, just to name all those things that are going to sort of grow out of this crazy situation. And also, and those are the things lost category, on the things gained category, new businesses and new opportunities and new ministry models and new leaders. And so it was really a pleasure to work side by side with Scott. I know speaking for me, for my team, they're great people, great men and women. And so often we've had people, and I've just seen it in our company and others, was like, well, okay, when can we get back to what we were doing? And I'm like, guys, we're not going back. So being ready to help frame people's reality as a leader has been a fun challenge too.
Scott, how about the pivot for you? Because that was fast.
Yeah, we accelerated really quick. And it's just a couple things. The opportunity was there. I mean, if we look at what God was doing with the state of the church and how that helped us evolve to a free model, and then that helped us to get everything ready. Think about all these technologies got put in place on, March 9th. I mean, literally we were knitting them together on the 9th, and we were deploying them out on the 10th, and then the world changed on the 11th. I mean, if that isn't God ordering your steps and making sure that you're in the right place at the right time with the right set of capabilities, that was just God ordained. And so, from our standpoint, I think, we just looked at it as what's the stewardship opportunity that we have and responsibility in the moment, and how do we move aggressively. We're as a leader, you need to satisfy. You need to be able to make decisions with limited amounts of information. And managers will look for lots and lots of information and lots of confirmation. And one of the difference between a manager and a leader is that leader at times needs to move very aggressively with small amounts of data, and to use their instincts, and to, use prayer and ask the God order the steps and provide the insights and the revelations. And I just feel like that happened in those first couple of days. And, we've got such great teams. The team that Barna has, and the team that we have at Gloo, we got a couple hundred people at Gloo, and, 20 great people over at Barna. And when you pull those two teams together, and they've melded so well, and then to be able to then move on a dime, I mean, I'm just so proud of the teams. The teams have really just come through and worked around the clock, and been able to make the moves because in the end, it all is about team. It's all about making sure that you're able to create the alignment and be able to run. You can go run out ahead as a leader. But if there ain't a team there with you, it's going to be a long, lonely slog. So it's really grateful.
I'd love to add one. Hearing you talk about all that, Scott, reminds me of one thing I'd love to say to listeners, and it's a bit personal, but it relates to why we were able to pivot so quickly. Is that I've had the privilege of hearing in my life from a lot of people. And Scott said this principle earlier of relationships catalyze growth. And one of the relationships, deep relationships in my life, is a guy by the name of Pete Richardson, who did a life plan for me back in 2008, where I started to think about what I wanted to do next and whether I would, where I would go. And that led really me to me buying Barna Group from George Barna. And I'd mentioned at the start of our podcast that, where our relationship, where Gloo and Barna started, was a week in Colorado in July. And the life plan that I started that week with was, in so many words, that I want to courageously lead the church into the future by energizing and equipping a new generation of Christian leaders. And I came to our whole team to say, hey, this is where I think I'm supposed to go. And I'd love to lead Barna, but even though I'm the owner, I'm happy to, to hear what you guys have to say about this. And the team, to their credit, and through the facilitation of Pete Richardson, who did both my life plan and then this strategic planning, we came to this vision of together, Barna 2.0, Barna Group 2.0, that we wanted to lead the church courageously into the future as a company. And so that's easy to say, and it's easy to put up on a board, but over the last month, as we've pivoted and as we've worked hard on, like the Church Pulse Weekly and the podcast and some of the things we're trying to do, and we're working hard at serving churches in some new ways, I've had to go back to, okay, well, this is what I said earlier, going through crisis. Well, who do you want to be on the other side? And so I've been able to go back to that commitment that I made in my life plan to help courageously lead the church into the future. And it was like, oh, well, this is a future defining moment, isn't it? Coronavirus. We want to have a 2.0 business. And even though it's easy for us to want to protect the things that we do as a company, and we should continue to do that, like, what if God's doing some new things? And I think back to one of my first conversations after I signed the deal with George Barna, and I get chills thinking about this conversation, because he said, Dave, this is now a shell. This company is now a shell for your vision, the vision that God's given you. And I don't want you to think for a day about what it is that I want you to do with this thing, because, like you gotta move on and start to lead the company. And he even said, I sold you the company. I hope this is not too private to share, but I think it's important for listeners to hear. I sold you the company because I began to see them responding to you in ways that they're not responding to me, or that for the church to change in the way it needs to change, like they need a new voice for Barna. And that was like, he was in his mid 50s when he sold me the business, and like how humble do you have to be to say, I can see how God's given, David Kinnaman, this young upstart, a chance to lead the church and to lead, the company bearing his name. And so that's where I think, as we think about disruption and the kind of leaders we want to become, and the kind of, and I say this to my kids and my family and to the team, like, God has me here for now. Maybe it's another couple months, maybe it's another couple years, maybe it's another couple decades. Like, I want to be that open-handed with this business and with what God's trying to do through us, that I could honestly say, like, as soon as God needs me to go pursue my vision and the company to pursue its vision, I'm open to what that might look like. Because that's how God uses us in these times of great change, is he wants us to be just leaning into what he has told us and who we're meant to be in him. He's created us for very particular purposes at very particular times. Turns out we don't control as much as we think we control. And so that's been just as I've gone through this last month, I keep going back to the ways the Lord spoke to me through relationship, through that process, through other things that God's shown me through the last 10 years and more, of what he intends for me, what he intends for this company. And so that's been a great pleasure. But I don't have any script for that. I don't have any like strategic plan for how it is that we'll change all the things we do for the post-coronavirus world. And we just try to every day show up and be faithful to that unique calling that God's placed in our lives today.
No, I think that's super good. And what I hear from both of you is you had a crystal clear sense of mission and calling. And this was simply a new adaptation, a new expression of that calling to fit the times, which is so helpful. Okay, I have to ask you, because I'm asking everybody this question: how big a disruption this is, and any thoughts on the new normal, whatever the new normal is. How I'm calling this a disruption now, not even the crisis so much. I just think of it that way, that somehow we got disrupted. But how deep and profound are the changes you think that are happening right now? And then any takes on what the new normal will be like? in business, in church, online, offline, physical, travel, whatever. I'm wide open because we're all trying to figure this out in real time.
The scale of the disruption is unprecedented, first of all. What's going on in our economy and what's going on socially, it's just unprecedented, right? And so I think, number one, we need to take stock of that and be aware of that and to acknowledge the cumulative trauma that exists around us. Because, when you're in trauma and you're in the midst of it, denial is, one way through. And certainly there's a certain part of it that's probably self-preservation and important. But number one, the disruption is massive. Number two, it is catapulting us into the future. It is catapulting us into the future. It is moving things socially, and it is moving things technologically, and it is moving things in terms of engagement at distance. All of these things, we are being catapulted into the future where, the social thing was to get on an airplane and to go have a meeting in a room together. That was what was the right social thing. Well, in the moment, the right social thing is not to do that. The social norms are some of the hardest norms to break when you have a technological transformation taking place in a society. So it's just amazing in terms of what's happening. We talked about, let's stay anchored in church or recovery or these organizations that are basically serving and primarily they're serving in a face-to-face because it's the face-to-face that the relationship catalyzes the growth. But what's going to happen is that right now everybody's developing digital muscles and digital skills, and this will subside. And we will go back to face-to-face, and we will go back to convening and meeting and hugging and shaking hands, and all of that stuff is going to happen. But we will have exercised new muscles that are going to serve us so well in the next decade ahead. So I'm just so excited in a certain sense in the midst of the trauma that, these things are creating, a stronger church, a stronger recovery industry, because we're having to be able to engage at distance. And when we get back from engaging at distance to engaging in the face-to-face, we will not leave that behind. We will bring that forward and we'll turbocharge the changes that we want to see in the world. So I think it is dramatic in terms of what it's doing, in terms of how it is catapulting us into the future.
David?
Yeah, I couldn't add too much more to that other than to say I think that without this disruption, our ability as the church to minister to Generation Z and millennials in the digital Babylon would not have I keep banging my head against the brick wall behind me. That church leaders just don't seem to understand that you can't just minister to people an hour and a half every couple of weeks. It's just like it's not enough to Christianize people's vision for the future. Well, this now forces us to think about digital disruption and digital ministry and digital discipleship. Again, how we innovate on that, not just to get people to show up to our sort of our usual online worship services, but to do ministry in all of life is going to be critical. And I think there are going to be some real innovative places that do that and do that well. And so I think this disruption, as Scott said, is going to force us into some really good rhythms that without it, we wouldn't have ever, it would have taken a long time, a couple generations probably before we began to do some of that. I do think that issues of anxiety and mental health are going to be even more front and center for a generation that was already living in an anxious age and dealing with high levels of anxiety. This is going to be a really interesting time. Is going to tell, sort of levels of suicide, levels of addiction, levels of anxiety, the financial pressures on sort of this gig economy, that the fragility and the precariousness of work for young adults, the indebtedness, the kind of questions of sort of civic government, big government, and how sort of the relationship between church and state is going to be altered going forward. I think that's going to be really interesting. I think it's been awesome how churches have shown up and said, great, we think for public health reasons, we're not going to worship. Could you have imagined just 2 months ago if government had said, churches, you're not going to have Easter you can't meet. And without the coronavirus, people would have been like, no way. Like the church is never going to shut its doors. But we have, for the right reasons, agreed to that. But there's going to be, over the course of the next number of months and years, real questions of the role of government and the role of the private practice of faith and the public practice of faith. So those are important questions that I think are still to be determined. But in particular, because I've got such a heart for this emerging generation, this next generation of Christian leaders and entrepreneurs, I'm so excited that this has happened. Not because all the things lost, all the things that people go through, but I think this is going to force us to really grapple with the world that this generation is already living in, this digital world, this disconnected world, like higher education, local churches. We're in businesses and areas of work that haven't really been disrupted. We keep kind of moving forward without a lot of change to our basic structure. And for some of that's because it's biblical. It goes back thousands of years. But for some of it, it's just like, well, this is just easier because our business models are based on, 4 years of tuition, so I think higher education is going to go through a ton of good, healthy disruption. We want to see those things, as Scripture says, these new wineskins made. You can't pour old wine into new wine into old wineskins. So I'm excited about that prophetic vision of what God's going to do with these new wineskins, these new businesses, these new entrepreneurs, these new models, these new approaches to ministry.
All right, I want to frame this final question in the right terminology. It's probably going to come out wrong. What are the winners doing right now? And what are those who are not going to win out of this disruption doing right now? So if you're going to move forward and you're actually going to advance your mission, let's put it that way, you're going to look at, without being opportunistic, there are some opportunities here. If you're moving forward, what are those people doing right now? And what are the people who perhaps will go under or not survive or just limp into the future? What are they doing right now?
I think the winners are certainly understanding the possibility of a long couple of years of disruption. Even though I think that we will have some solutions and medical testing and quarantining will catch up in the coming months. I think like the next school year, starting in the fall of 2020, is going to be very different. It's still anybody's guess as to whether students will be coming back to campuses or how classes will be conducted or how concerts or sporting events. And so I think the best people are sort of taking the chance. One of my mentors says, never waste a crisis. So they're really thinking through, okay, what will this look like over a couple of year horizon? And so they're making plans for today as though the world is going to continue to change, and we can't predict how that change is going to play itself out. Where like the economy reopens and everything is back to normal. So they're planning for a new normal. That for me seems like a sure bet of the kind of things that the winners are doing today.
Yeah, I agree with all that, David, and I would add to it that, as a population, our jobs are pretty simple right now. It's like wash our hands and social distance, right? And, so when the crisis is over, let's stop social distancing, but let's keep washing our hands, right? That's probably just a good idea to carry on, right? And the same thing. I mean, I think the winners right now are the people, in particular, as we're talking to church leaders and the different types of leaders that are trying to help people in the areas of personal growth. It's about engagement at distance. It's not about, hey, streaming a service. That's just consumption. The key isn't, people don't gain out of consumption, they gain out of contribution, right? So being able to then take these opportunities to be able to right now understand, what does it mean to be able to get engagement at distance? How can I know people at distance? How can I catalyze some growth at distance? How do I catalyze the communities to self-form at distance and to be able to allow that energy to continue to move? That the winners are going to be the ones that are leaning into that and not just trying to survive the moment, but really trying to take advantage and thrive in the moment. Because if you can do that, then when you come out of that, you're going to get everything back, plus have all of this, and I do agree that it's not going to move as quick as people are thinking. People are going to move slowly back into these social settings. We're going to have probably a second wave. We're going to have, all of those normal things that we're going to have to deal with. I feel really bad for the businesses that, are really going through the trauma, through the enterprises, through the churches that are going through, the really significant trauma. And I just pray that for those businesses and for those ministries that, out of this can come, new birth, new life, new skills that wouldn't have been there. So that would be the prayer as we move into the future here.
Well, this is so rich. David, you'll be back on many times. And of course, we're on our other podcast now, the Church Pulse Weekly. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
You can't get rid of me, can you?
No, it's a good problem to have. I'll tell you that. And Scott, it's been a joy to be able to work with you, and we'll have to have you back on. And I want to drill down into that amazing career trajectory from a leadership perspective. But it's a joy to be working with both of you right now in the midst of this crisis. And Scott, your company powering a lot of the technology that for free helps churches, and working together on Church Pulse Weekly. You can find that at churchpulseweekly.com, or just search my name, David's name, on any podcast app, or Church Pulse Weekly. You can subscribe there. We hope you will. And I wanted to take you under the hood. This is what's happening behind the scenes. This is what's been going on in the last 35 days in the case of when this conversation was had for this leadership conference. And it's an opportunity to serve the church. And I would just say to all the leaders listening, you have an opportunity to serve too. And it probably means, I wrote down while you guys were talking, the difference between an interruption and a disruption. An interruption is like, oh, I'm just paused for a minute. I'll come back. A disruption is like, oh no, everything's changed. And I think it's pretty clear we're in one of those moments where everything changed. And we certainly want all the leaders listening, whether you lead a large church, small church, medium-sized church, large business, small business, wherever you happen to be in the marketplace, that you come out stronger. And there are opportunities. This is like, some of us are horse and buggy makers in the age of the automobile. And now it's time to figure out how to make tires or whatever we happen to be doing. But we can do it because people need to be transported. And the modes are changing. The ministry models are changing. But I think getting the kind of data that is now possible is going to help us all. So thank you both very much. Any final thoughts?
I'm just grateful to be partnering with the two of you. It's been such a joy. I mean, the journey that David and I have been on over the last year has really been a godsend on so many fronts. The level of trust that we've been able to develop in such short periods of time that have allowed us to be able to invest deeply and to move quickly and to reduce costs has been spectacular, and I'm grateful for that. And likewise, Carey, in terms of intersecting you, is your partnership with David has been longer. It's just been a joy, and so I'm grateful, and I feel honored to be part of it.
Likewise. Well, thank you so much, guys. And Scott, if people want to find Gloo, they know where they can find David at Barna Group and on our podcast. But if they want to know more about Gloo, GLOO.us. Have I got that right?
That's right. Gloo.us.
Mm-hmm. So that's awesome. And are you active on social? I don't know that I follow you yet. So
no, I try to keep a pretty low profile.
Hidden. Well, thanks for popping out for this podcast. We appreciate it.
So,
David, Scott, thank you very much. Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.